The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History magazine. Horse racing was a popular sport in the American West. As preparations for the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago were being made, it was suggested that a grand horse race from the West to Chicago should take place. On today's episode, we explore the planning, the promotion, the opposition, and the story of the actual race itself through the 1972 Nebraska History magazine article, The Chadron-Chicago 1,000-Mile Cowboy Race by William Deal Jr. Racing ranked as an outstanding and popular sport of the American West, the most popular being the horse race. Horse racing established itself in the West with the mountain men as they assembled at a rendezvous and tested their skills against one another. At various isolated military posts, horse racing provided excitement and resulted in large amounts of money changing hands. Horse racing was found at county fairs, 4th of July celebrations, and mining camps. Horse racing became a favorite form of diversion for the people of the plains because, as historian Everett Dick puts it, a man's horse, quote, was a precious possession, appreciated and admired by all, end quote. A special race might be announced in newspapers and constituted an all-absorbing topic for people days before the event and afterward. The sport occupied such a special place in the small, early railroadless towns of the plains that no member of the male population ever missed such an event unless he was compelled to do so by illness. A horse race elicited even more attention from a cowboy because it was a superb test of endurance both for himself and his horse, and an opportunity to display his skills before his peers. As preparations were made for the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, with its emphasis upon American accomplishments and customs, it was not surprising that someone suggested a horse race from the West to Chicago. Such a race, its promoters suggested, would reflect the passing age of expansion and conquest of the vast American West, and thus dramatize the Columbian Exposition's central focus on America. The projected cowboy race from Chadron, Nebraska to Chicago in June of 1893 was designed to pit skilled Western horsemen against each other over a 1,000-mile route spanning 3 states, Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois, and thus call attention to the people and their way of life on the plains. And Chadron was glad to have a place in the sun. On March 22, 1893, a group of Chadron citizens held the first formal meeting with the planning of the Great World's Fair Cowboy Race and its objective. A committee which was given full authority in the proposed race was named, with A.C. Putnam its president and N.H. Weir its corresponding secretary. The committee determined to make the undertaking a success with a big S and established the following tentative rules. Quote, "The race will be open to anyone riding Western horses. Horses must be bred and raised west of the Mississippi River. Saddles to weigh not less than 35 pounds. Rider, saddle, and blanket to weigh not less than 150 pounds. 2 horses are allowed each rider. Riders must register at places on the route to be designated later. Entries close on June 1st. Race to start from Blaine Hotel, Chadron on June 13th. Purse to be divided into 4 moneys. The one for the winner will be not less than $1,000, end quote. By May, several other arrangements were concluded by the committee. The race was to finish at Buffalo Bill's Wild West, the prototype and the most famous of the Western-type shows, which occupied ground next to the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and showman William F. Cody, an adopted Nebraskan, added $500 to the original $1,000 prize money. The Colt Firearms Company offered another special prize, a revolver, one of its cowboy companions, which would be used to fire the starting shot of the race. After the formal announcement of the impending race, the magnitude of the horse race from Chadron to Chicago greatly distressed Eastern humane societies, which went on record against it. The secretary of the Aurora, Illinois Humane Society wrote the Chadron Citizen, quote, "It would be better for the boys to choose some other amusement in coming to the great fair, something that does not have about it the elements of cruelty," end quote. Meanwhile, in Boston, President George G. Angeli of the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals worried about the anticipated 300 or more participants in the race. Obviously an exaggeration. He made the following offer on behalf of the American Humane Society, quote, $100 in money or a gold medal costing that amount to the man or woman who shall do most to prevent this terrible race, which, if accomplished, will be, in the view of all of the humane people of the world, both Christian and heathen, a national disgrace, end quote. Harvey Weir, the secretary of the race committee, received a letter from John G. Shortall, president of the Illinois Humane Society, asking that all those contemplating the long-distance race be notified of the following Illinois law, quote, "Whoever shall be guilty of cruelty to any animal in any of the ways mentioned in this section shall be fined not less than $3 nor more than $200 first, by overloading, overdriving, overworking, cruelly beating, torturing, tormenting, mutilating, or cruelly killing an animal or causing or knowingly allowing the same to be done," end quote. The humane societies were unable to gain support for their arguments in Chadron, but in Illinois, where the race would end, their influence was felt in the proclamation issued by Governor John P. Altgeld on June 14, 1893. It read, quote, "To all officers of the law, being reliably advised that a long-distance horse race from Chadron, Nebraska to Chicago, a distance of over 700 miles, is about to take place, and that a similar race in Europe a year ago for only half this distance resulted in the death of many of the horses used, was a productive of such barbarous cruelty to animals as to shock humanity, and having reason to believe that this proposed race would be accompanied by equal or even greater cruelty and barbarity, which will be in violation of the laws of this state for the prevention of cruelty to animals. I hereby call upon all officers upon whom devolve the execution of the laws, as well as the good citizens, to see to it that no violation of our law takes place, and that anyone guilty of it shall be promptly brought to justice. We will welcome the so-called cowboys into our state and bid them come in all their glory and have thoroughly enjoyable time while among us. But we cannot permit the laws of Illinois to be trampled underfoot as a matter of sport," end quote. On the other hand, Nebraskans' attitudes scoffed at the Eastern critics, as was reflected in a news item from the O'Neill editor, quote, "A gentleman from the East remarked to the writer the other day that everything possible should be done to prevent this terrible race. Just think," he says, "of keeping a horse on a dead run to Chicago. Such a deluded tenderfoot should never cross the Missouri River," end quote. While humane societies shouted their war cry to stop the race, preparations for the race continued in Chadron, and riders were exercising their horses. The exercise consisted of 20 to 30-mile ride daily to keep the horses trim. Chadron citizens were speculative about a possible woman entrant into the race. Quote, "What has become of the Denver woman is the interesting question in cowboy circles. No one seems to know whether she is on her way here or not. Some think she is up the country somewhere and will show up all right a day or two before the start," end quote. A subscription paper was taken around the city of Chadron the 1st of June to collect the necessary $400 needed to complete the prize money, which was raised without any trouble. On June 2nd, the race committee, hoping to attract more riders, decided to receive entries until the start of the race at 5:30 p.m., June 13th. On the day of the race, Paul Fontaine, president of the Minneapolis Humane Society, and a veteran named Tatro arrived in Chadron to remonstrate with the committee before the race started. Accompanied by David C. Doc Middleton and members of the committee, Fontaine and Tatro inspected some of the horses and attended an open meeting of the committee in the parlors of the Hotel Blaine at 11 o'clock. The Humane Society representatives presented their arguments and proponents were invited to reply. Finally, Jack Hale of Sturgis, South Dakota, suggested that Fontaine and Tatro travel by rail with the committee on a course paralleling the race, stopping at the registered points and inspecting the condition of the horses. The suggestion met with approval, and Fontaine agreed to meet the riders at each registering point. This way, he felt he could keep a close check on the horses and also prevent riders from being harassed by overzealous backers. Since Fontaine represented the Humane Society, the Omaha Daily Bee said his presence would put an end to the possibility that the race might be stopped. With a workable arrangement established with the Humane Society representatives, final preparations for the race took place during the afternoon. Each horse was marked with the road brand for identification purposes, a figure 2 being placed under the mane. Just prior to the start of the race, the knowledge that John Barry was to ride in the race drew criticism from other riders. Barry had been invited by the committee the week previously to help lay out the route. Committeemen at first had refused admission to the race to any of those charting the course. Later, Jack Hale's rider fell ill, and Barry became his substitute. Because of Barry's prior knowledge of the route, the committee voted to bar him from the competition for the prize money, but Barry was determined to ride in the race even if he didn't get a part of the $1,000. The Chadron Citizen speculated on Barry's persistent interest in participating in the race. Quote, "It is said that big money, some $2,500, is offered for the winning horses, and John isn't going to Chicago for his health," end quote. Around 4 o'clock, a large crowd assembled in the vicinity of the Blaine Hotel, the starting point. The Citizen described the scene. Quote, "The streets were filled with a struggling mass of humanity, anxious to get a look at the horses and men who were to take part in the greatest race of the kind ever attempted, while the roofs, windows, and other points of advantage were preempted long before the start," end quote. The crowd, estimated at 3,000 people, testified to the interest held in the race by the people of Chadron. The members of the race committee, along with Fontaine and Tatro, were standing on the hotel balcony. People gathered not only in front of the hotel, but a line of expectant faces formed a line for 1/2 mile east of the hotel. The scene was enlivened by a cornet band, Jester's Freak Band, assembled in the shade of the telegraph office and playing rousing musical selections. As each rider approached the starting line, he was loudly cheered by his friends, but the greatest yell went up when Doc Middleton made his appearance. It was evident he was Chadron's favorite. Once all the riders were present, a group picture was taken. 25 to 30 entries had been anticipated, though only 9 riders showed up. The limited entry list was attributed to, quote, "the cry raised by the humane element and the feeling outside of Chadron that perhaps the race might not start at all," end quote. The names of the entrymen, the horses, and their riders were Mike Elmore, Hemingford, Nebraska; 2 horses, Wide Awake, Bay Gelding, and Monte Cristo, Brown Stallion; Dave Douglas, rider; Doc Middleton, Chadron, Nebraska; 2 horses, Geronimo, Brown Gelding, and Bay Jimmy, Bay Gelding, Doc Middleton, rider; Abe Jones, Whitewood, South Dakota; 2 horses, Romeo, Bay Gelding; George, Black Gelding; Geo Jones, rider; P.G. Cooper from Crawford, Nebraska; 2 horses, Outlaw, Buckskin Gelding, and Joe Bush, a Sorrel Gelding; Emmett Albright, rider; Joe B. Gillespie, Coxville, Nebraska, with 2 horses, Billy Mack, Chestnut Gelding, and Billy Schaefer, Gray Gelding; Joe B. Gillespie, the rider; Jasper Stevens, Nest City, Kansas; 2 horses, General Grant, Brown Gelding, and Nick, a Brown Gelding, Jasper Stevens, rider; Joe Campbell from Denver, Colorado; 1 horse, Boom D.I., a Bay Gelding, Joe Campbell, rider; Chase Smith, Hot Springs, South Dakota; 2 horses, Dynamite, Sorrel Gelding, and Red Wing, a Bay Gelding, Chase Smith, a rider; Jack Hale, Sturgis, South Dakota; 2 horses, Poison, Chestnut Stallion, and Sandy, a bay gelding, John Barry rider. The cowboys were to check in at registering stations along the route, in Nebraska at Chadron, Long Pine, O'Neill, and Wausau. In Iowa, Sioux City, Galva, Fort Dodge, Iowa Falls, Waterloo, Manchester, and Dubuque. And in Illinois, Freeport, DeKalb, and Chicago. Secretary Weir provided each rider with the route map. At 5:45, Sheriff James C. Dahlman reminded the riders of the rules relating to the contest. Chief of the Fire Department, J.O. Hartzell, then arose, holding the revolver presented by the Colt Firearms Company, and said, quote, "Gentlemen, the time for the cowboy race from Chadron to Chicago to start is upon us. Be kind to take good care of your horses. I know you will conduct yourselves as gentlemen and will, I trust, uphold the good name of Chadron and Nebraska," end quote. Hartzell fired the pistol, and the most famous and interesting race of modern times had started, according to the Omaha News report. Actually, there was nothing exciting about the start of the race. A few of the riders trotted off about 5 miles an hour while others paced their horses at a walk. A common remark heard by W.L. Bailey, editor of the Chadron Citizen, was that the walkers were the ones most likely to win. Spectators followed the riders out of town as Joe Gillespie took an early lead. The last rider to leave Chadron was Doc Middleton. Hundreds of well-wishers had surrounded him in effort to shake his hand and bid him Godspeed. His wife and 2 children pushed their way through the crowd, and Middleton picked up the children, kissed them, and then kissed his wife. The scene reportedly, quote, brought tears to the eyes of many, end quote. As Middleton set out on his journey, he remarked, quote, "Boys, I'm last now, but I may be first at Chicago," end quote. The Citizen also presented some interesting reflections on the beginning of the race 2 days after the riders had left. They wrote, quote, "The much advertised cowboy race to Chicago has started, and so far as this city is concerned, its share is accomplished. The novelty of the race attracted widespread attention, and the newspaper correspondents made the most of the chance in the extravagant burlesque style well understood by Western people, but taken as gospel truth by uninitiated Eastern ones. On June 13th, at the crack of the pistol, the wild ride will begin and continue day and night under whip and spur until a winner reaches Chicago," said the correspondents. Stripped of all the sensational language, 9 men, 9 Western men, not 300 wild cowboys, started for Chicago. The men had good horses, and better examples of their kind would be hard to find elsewhere than West. These horses, in plain, simple language, were good types of Western Plains horses, capable of long, continuous travel, end quote. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch's coverage of the race contained several sensational charges. The Missouri newspaper claimed a number of the riders had criminal records. Doc Middleton was used as an example and described as, quote, "one of the boldest all-around bad men in the Black Hills district," end quote. It did, however, refer to Middleton's reformed behavior, which allowed for an, quote, "occasional little debate with six-shooter in which he invariably comes off a winner," end quote. The other contestants of the race were classified with one sweeping generalization. This group was, quote, "one of the most daring and famous bands which ever threw the leather on a bronco for a jaunt together, and nearly everyone on the list has a reputation all through the West in the line of riding, fighting, and general bravery," end quote. The Courier-Journal of Louisville, Kentucky, reflected a positive attitude toward the race. Quote, "What has mistakenly been called a cruel and brutal contest promises to develop into a splendid test of Western horseflesh, free of inhumanity and worthy of the Columbian year," end quote. Middleton, Gillespie, and Stevens were the first riders to reach Hay Springs, over 20 miles southeast of Chadron. The evening of June 13th found all of the men but one spending the night farther east at Rushville. George Jones had decided to spend the night in Hay Springs. The riders kept a fairly close watch on old Joe Gillespie when they left Chadron in order to use him as a guide through the rugged Pine Ridge area. Gillespie, aware of their intentions, rose early on June 14th to put some distance between himself and the other contestants. According to Nebraska Land's account, quote, he ran smack into a reception committee of Doc and some of the other boys who made it plain he wasn't going anywhere without them. Never a man could argue with Judge Colt's equalizers. Joe figured he could see his way clear to give his rivals the guided tour treatment, end quote. 6 o'clock found a group of 6 riders, including Middleton, Gillespie, Stevens, Berry, and Douglas, watering their horses at a farmhouse 6 miles south of Gordon. An hour later, 2 more riders passed the same point. Jones reached Gordon by noon, and after a 2-hour rest, continued on his way. The evening of June 14th found Jones spending the night at Merriam, a station on the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley Railroad, while Middleton passed the night at the house of a farmer directly south of Cody. The cowboy riders progressed through Valentine on June 15th, and Jones reaching the city in time for 7 o'clock supper. Dave Douglas, who arrived at 9 o'clock, and Jones continued their way before midnight. The majority of the riders passed south of Valentine. The pace of the riders was reported to be 4 miles an hour during the heat of the day and nearly 8 miles an hour at night. Long Pine, Nebraska, the second registering point of the race, was first reached at 4:36 p.m. on June 16th by Jim Stevens, Joe Gillespie, and Doc Middleton, who were riding together. They crossed the Long Pine Chautauqua grounds, a former rendezvous of Middleton and his gang, and registered at a Dwinell house at 4:45 p.m. Their horses were inspected and judged to be in excellent condition. Stevens stopped only a few minutes in Long Pine. Gillespie left at 5:07 and Middleton at 5:15. Emmett Albright reached Long Pine at 5:30 and rested 30 minutes before going on. He had been with Stevens, Gillespie, and Middleton the night before. They had slept in the Sandhills 12 miles west of Woodlake, but Albright became quite sick at Ainsworth, supposedly the reason he fell behind the advance guard of riders. Charles Smith registered at Long Pine at 9:05 and continued eastward. John Berry, the silent man of the West, spent the night of June 16th at Ainsworth, getting a good night's sleep. People in Long Pine speculated Stevens, Gillespie, Middleton, and Albright would reach Atkinson before stopping for the night. They also raised the question whether the men would be able to stand the long ride to Chicago. As the participants made progress along the route, the Cowboys gained press coverage and were now pictured as heroes by newsmen. The inhabitants of the village of Newport became anxious to view the now famous men when it was reported they would reach their town the evening of June 16th. Night came as a throng of watchers dwindled away while awaiting the riders. Finally, at 10:35 p.m., Jim Stevens rode into the village and was directed to the livery barn of George Barber. News of the arrival of one of the famous riders spread quickly, and people reassembled to watch Stevens carefully tend his horse by giving him feed and a drink of oatmeal water. Stevens then lay down and slept until Middleton and Gillespie arrived around 11:20. They quickly tended their horses, then all 3 men went to the Lee Hotel, quote, where they found a bountiful supper prepared for them, end quote. Reporters noted Middleton's fatigue and were attracted by Stevens' unique attire. They wrote, quote, he wears a white cowboy hat, ornamented with a blue ribbon band on which is a mosaic design of rattlesnake rattles. Although a hideous-looking ornament, it was presented, or rather made for him by a lady in Chadron, and it gives point to the name by which he is called out west, Rattlesnake Pete, end quote. While these men were the attraction of the day in Newport, the other 6 riders were supposedly lost in the Sandhills or else laid up for repairs. The morning of June 17th found the last of the riders registering at Long Pine, Dave Douglas at 5:55 a.m., Joe Campbell at 6:05, and John Berry at 6:15. George Jones arrived at 7:15. None remained long in the city. John Berry refused the night to register since he was riding under protest, made out an affidavit instead. Campbell and Douglas reached Bassett by 7:35 a.m., ate breakfast there. Middleton, Gillespie, and Stevens left Newport at 6 o'clock sharp, passed through Stuart at 8, and reached Atkinson by 9. Albright was roughly 10 miles behind them. While the Cowboys were making their way toward the third registering point at O'Neill on June 17th, the official party arrived by rail at 10 o'clock to prepare for their reception. Paul Fontaine of the Humane Society informed newspaper correspondents that he was perfectly satisfied with the race so far and asked them to make public the following information. Quote, "We desire to have the public understand that insofar as the race committee made us a committee to judge any of the overdriving or cruelty and to lay off any horses that we may determine, we request that the racers be allowed to go their way unmolested between register stations. All horses are examined at each station by us. No overdriving or cruelty will be allowed. The riders have thus far won the approval of all concerned, and we trust no trouble will occur. The riders are expected to be here at any moment." End quote. After dinner, a large crowd assembled in O'Neill to await the arrival of the Cowboy riders. Jim Stevens was the first to appear, reaching O'Neill at 1:30 p.m., but was closely followed by Joe Gillespie and Doc Middleton. They ate at the Hotel Evans, registered with Secretary Weir of the race committee, and had their horses inspected by the Humane Society. Middleton received a warm reception from a number of his old acquaintances and their encouragement for his success in the race. The last 4 riders of the race made it to O'Neill late on June 17th or early the next morning. John Barry arrived and registered at 11 p.m. on the 17th and departed for Wausau at 4:30 a.m. the next morning. After Barry's departure, George Jones arrived to register at 6 a.m. and headed eastward at 8 o'clock. Joe Campbell arrived at 9:15 a.m. but remained in O'Neill long enough to register. The last rider, Dave Douglas, made it in at 11:45 a.m. and reported he was not feeling well and thinking of dropping out of the race. The heightened public interest in the race was reflected in the columns of the Omaha Daily Bee as the riders arrived in Wausau, the 4th registering station. Its headlines read, "Causing much excitement," and "Hundreds of people gather at Wausau to welcome the Cowboy races." The Bee described the excitement in Wausau on June 18th, quote, "To such an extent is the excitement centered in the Cowboy race that large crowds of people from all neighboring towns gathered here today to watch their arrival," end quote. During the afternoon, the anticipation of the crowd was fulfilled as the Cowboys reached Wausau. Cheers were raised when, amid a cloud of dust, 3 riders, each leading a horse, trotted up to the Saxton House, dismounted, and registered in the following order: Gillespie first, Stevens a close second, Middleton third, 5 minutes later. The men remained in town roughly 10 minutes to water their horses, which were still in good condition. A crowd gathered around the men and horses, and people pulled hairs from the horsetails and manes for souvenirs. The riders, Middleton leading but followed closely by Gillespie and Stevens, left Wausau on the excellent road reaching eastward. The last riders reaching Wausau and registered at the following times: Albright and Smith at 7:33 p.m., Barry at 8:10, Jones at 7, and Campbell 7:45. Each of these riders claimed he was still in the race and expressed confidence in reaching Chicago first. Dave Douglas had dropped out of the race. The advance guard of the racers continued to consist of Middleton, Gillespie, and Stevens. However, at Coldridge, Middleton was forced to abandon his best horse, Romeo, which had gone lame. The horse had been improperly shod at Chadron and was slightly lame before reaching O'Neill, where it had been reshod under the supervision of the Humane Society officers, but even this measure did not help. Middleton, Gillespie, and Stevens passed through the village of Ponca around 2:30 p.m. on June 19th, the latter reportedly walking half of the time in an effort to save his horses. Rattlesnake Pete Stevens, Doc Middleton, and Old Joe Gillespie left the ferry on the Iowa shore of the Missouri River at 8:05 p.m. and arrived in Sioux City, Iowa, the 5th registering station, in 7 minutes. A large crowd was awaiting the riders as they crossed into Iowa. The scene was described in the Nebraska State Journal as follows, quote, "Covington wagers have kept the people on this side of the river in suspense all day. They would have a rider come up to the landing leading a horse, then a shout would go up which almost created a stampede on the Prohibition side. When the genuine race's arrival was made, a crowd had collected, through which the riders had to press their way. That was fairly frantic. In order to break away, the boys pushed ahead, and a stampede was caused, which was taken part in by everyone present. The citizens had to run or climb a telegraph pole to escape the rush. The horses are in good shape, and the riders are all confident of getting through, having passed the scrutiny of the humanitarians without trouble." End quote. On June 20th, Sioux City, Iowa was the focus of activities of the Chadron-Chicago Cowboy Race. The riders trailing the front runners were closing the gap between themselves and the leaders of the race. Emmett Albright, Charles Smith, and John Barry arrived together at 10:04 a.m. Barry registered by affidavit once again. The riders found Middleton at the hotel, but were informed that Stevens and Gillespie had left the city at 6 o'clock. George Jones and Joe Campbell, the last riders to reach Sioux City, were now only 4 to 6 hours behind the leaders. At the time of the riders' arrival in Sioux City, the cowboy race had been in progress for 7 days. The riders had crossed the state of Nebraska and covered over 400 miles. Only one rider, Dave Douglas, had dropped out of the race, and only one horse had been removed because of its physical condition. Great interest in the contest continued as crowds of people came out to cheer, greet, and encourage the riders on to Chicago. The race was a happy diversion for these people of the plains. Stevens and Gillespie continued in the lead. However, things were not going so well for Rattlesnake Pete. As Tatro had predicted when he inspected the horses in Sioux City, Stevens was obliged to abandon one mount, Nick, 20 miles east of that town because of colic. Stevens' personal health was also being affected, as he had been suffering from the heat and his vision was becoming limited to short distances. Despite this, Stevens and Gillespie pressed on to Moville, Iowa, where they were met at noon, June 20th, by the Moville Cornet Band and a large crowd of citizens, all anxious to see both horses and riders. The horses, stabled at the livery and judged in good condition, eagerly ate the feed given them. Gillespie and Stevens, showered by questions from local citizens, were escorted to the Hotel Traver for dinner. They were in good spirits, but Rattlesnake Pete was suffering from a slight hemorrhage of the lungs caused by the constant jolt of riding in a slow trot. Dr. Dewey, a local physician, attended Stevens, giving him medicine and a prescription to be filled along the route. Stevens and Gillespie started on their way at 1:30 p.m. John Barry passed by Moville 1/2 mile south on the Correctionville Road at 5 o'clock, 3½ hours behind the leaders. 3 miles behind Barry were Albright and Smith. At 3:30 p.m., Jones and Campbell reached Moville, where Jones stopped to feed his horse, but Campbell remained there only long enough to water and bathe his horse before continuing. The approach of the leaders of the cowboy race continued to create a great deal of interest in towns along the route travel. At Galva, Iowa, the 6th registration point, the Omaha Daily Bee described the mood caused by the race. They wrote, quote, "The excitement here has been intense. All day yesterday, people were driving in from the surrounding country and neighborhood towns, and the streets presented an animated scene. There were people here who came from places 35 miles away to see the arrival of the cowboy racers. Flags were flying, and night was made hideous by firing of anvils. People walked the streets until a late hour and then had to give it up for the night." End quote. The leaders of the race were not to reach Galva until the morning of June 21st. Gillespie and Stevens had spent the night in Holstein and registered at 6:45 a.m. in Galva. After their vigil the night before, most Galvans had retired, but a few were on the streets to cheer the two cowboys' arrival. The men had their horses fed at the livery and then found time to have breakfast themselves. Riding from Correctionville, John Barry reached Galva by 7:45 a.m. and left at 10:20, followed by Stevens and Gillespie. Jones, Albright, and Smith were expected in Galva before noon of the 21st. The leaders had hoped to reach Fort Dodge around 7 o'clock that evening, but heavy rains forced them to stop at Pomeroy, 25 miles short of their goal for the night. Fort Dodge, Iowa was the 7th registering station, and the three leaders advanced on it post-haste. Stevens, the first rider to reach Fort Dodge, arrived at 8:15 a.m. on June 22nd. Less than 1/2 hour behind him was the still silent John Barry, who registered at 7:40 a.m. Stevens's horse was judged to be a little tired and sleepy, while Barry's horses were in fine fettle. Barry left Fort Dodge at noon, just before the arrival of Gillespie at 12:26 p.m. Stevens and Gillespie rode out of the city together, heading east at 2 o'clock. The condition of the riders was noted by reporters at this stop. Gillespie had lost 20 pounds of flesh since leaving Sioux City, Iowa, while Barry was troubled with a sprained ankle, which was getting better but still caused him trouble. George Jones registered at Fort Dodge at 6 o'clock, and Joe Campbell made it to the city by 7:20 p.m. Albright and Smith finally arrived at Fort Dodge during the evening of June 22nd. Smith did not stop, but Albright rested until 8:40 p.m. before heading eastward. While these men were registering at Fort Dodge, the leaders of the race, Stevens, Barry, and Gillespie, had already clocked in and were resting at the 8th stop, Iowa Falls. Stevens and Gillespie had arrived at 8:20 p.m., followed in 30 minutes by Barry. The morning of June 23rd saw Campbell leaving Fort Dodge at 6:30 a.m. At Iowa Falls, Barry left at 8:15 a.m., with Gillespie and Stevens taking the road at 10:40. Far to the rear, Doc Middleton finally reached Fort Dodge at noon, June 23rd, the last to register there, and continued on in an hour. George Jones reached Iowa Falls at 8:40 p.m., while Barry led the way into Waterloo, Iowa registration station number 9 at 9:40 p.m. There he was greeted by Inspector Tatro, Harvey Weir, and Major John Burke, General Manager of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. A humorous incident took place in Waterloo just before Barry's arrival. The people of the town were expecting Barry when a lone horseman rode in, quote, plodding through the mud and rain, and was instantly taken for Barry, end quote. The man was cornered by a Chicago Intern-Ocean reporter who rushed him to the hotel for an exclusive interview. The man stowed away a good supper at the reporter's expense while providing news of the race. The imposter was suddenly unmasked with the arrival at the hotel of Major John Burke and George Barry, John's brother. George announced that the man was no brother of his, and the reporter shamefacedly left. Gillespie and Stevens' arrival in Waterloo was delayed by a stop in Cedar Falls to make $10 by riding around the ring in a circus. Barry continued to maintain his lead, arriving in Manchester, the 10th registering point, at 7 p.m. on June 24th. He pushed on to Earlville, 12 miles from Manchester, reaching that town by 9 o'clock and departing for Dubuque at 9:45. George Jones caught up with Stevens and Gillespie in Winthrop, Iowa, and the three rode together for a while toward Manchester. Gillespie and Stevens pushed ahead of Jones and entered Manchester sometime between 8:30 and 9:30. Gillespie's horse, Billy Schaefer, became ill, and the two men stayed in Manchester for the evening. Doc Middleton finally reached Waterloo at 9:40 p.m. and left immediately for Independence, located about halfway to Manchester. Dyersville was Barry's stopping place the night of June 24th, but early the next morning he left for Dubuque, the 11th official stop, reaching the town at 9:30 a.m. Stevens, passing Farley at 8:05 a.m., became at 12:30 p.m. on June 25th the second rider to arrive in Dubuque just as Barry was crossing the bridge into Illinois with horses which were described as fresh and in excellent condition. Rattlesnake Pete Stevens was resting for 2 hours in Dubuque before heading into Illinois when Old Joe Gillespie arrived at 1:15 p.m. His chestnut gelding, Billy Mack, was described as lame, while his second mount, Billy Schaefer, which had been ill in Manchester, was now in prime condition. Gillespie himself was extremely tired, but in high spirits as he entered Illinois at 3:10 p.m. Stevens crossed the Mississippi River at 2:25 p.m., after which his horses were examined and found to be in good condition. Jones reached Dubuque at 5:55 p.m. and rode toward the Mississippi at 7:15. Smith arrived at 6:30 p.m. and departed for Illinois at 7:15, with one of his horses slightly lame. Meanwhile, back in Iowa, Doc Middleton and Emmett Albright, traveling together, left Manchester at 2 p.m. on June 25th and were not expected in Dubuque until June 26th. The Cowboy race had been in progress for 12 days. It had taken the riders 5 days to cross Iowa, and they had traveled over 800 miles of the route to Chicago. One more horse had been removed from the race because of its physical condition. Only 7 riders continued to Illinois from Dubuque since Doc Middleton became the second man to drop out. The race continued to attract a great deal of excitement in towns along the route in Iowa. 3.5 hours after leaving Dubuque, on the 25th, John Barry passed north of Galena, Illinois, heading towards Council Hill and the Apple River before stopping for the night. By 10 p.m., Jones and Smith passed Galena, but the whereabouts of Gillespie and Stevens were not certain. Barry maintained his lead into Freeport, Illinois, the 12th registration point at 9:30 a.m. on June 26th, and at DeKalb, the 13th stop and final checkpoint before Chicago at 11 p.m. Barry left his gelding, Sandy, at DeKalb and continued on to Chicago at 11:05, riding his stallion, Poison. On June 27th, John Barry was the first rider of the Chadron-Chicago Cowboy Race to reach the grounds of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. The arrival time was 9:30 a.m., 13 days and 16 hours since the departure from Chadron. Barry gave this account of the last segment of the race. He said, quote, "I left DeKalb at 11:05 p.m. on Poison, and I kept pounding along as fast as I could without hurting the horse. When we reached Turner, we got a telegram from DeKalb stating that Smith and Gillespie were just 2 hours and 30 minutes behind, so I knew I had the race sure. I fed and watered between Elburn and Lodi. We took the straight St. Charles Road and struck Maywood about 7 o'clock this morning, and I was afraid for the horse when we struck the pavement for fear he would break down. He ain't used to pavements, you know. I rode the last 150 miles in 24 hours, end quote. Only a small crowd was at the gates of Cody's show to greet Barry. The onlookers were astonished at his physical size, one remarking, quote, "Why, he's only a little bit of a man," end quote. Barry rode to Buffalo Bill's tent and dismounted. Cody stepped forward to greet him, saying as he shook his hand, quote, "You are the first man in. You are all right, John. You are all right," end quote. A gleam of pleasure spread over Barry's bronzed and bearded features. A reporter for the Chicago Evening Journal characterized Barry as a picturesque figure, not attired in the typical dress of the cowboy. He wore a pair of much-used brown trousers, a blue shirt, and a cloth cap, with the brim turned down around his head. His face was brown and showed a 3 days' growth of beard. After Cody's initial greeting, members of the press and performers of the Wild West show pressed around Barry to offer congratulations. Sharing the center of attention with Barry was his horse, Poison. A comparison was made between the rider and the horse. Barry was rated the sorriest, sleepiest, and most tired, while Poison was evaluated as showing no signs of being sleepy, tired, and sore. The horse seemed to be in good enough condition to travel another 100 miles. With assurances that Poison would be well cared for, Barry, after cleaning up a bit, allowed himself to be conducted to the dining hall of the Wild West show for breakfast. His meal of chicken, biscuits, and coffee he ate, quote, "with gusto born of 1,040 miles of hard riding," end quote. Barry evaluated his own condition as follows, quote, "Sore. Well, I should say I was. I did not feel much like sitting down, but I am so sleepy I can't talk. I have had no sleep for 10 days to amount to anything, but I feel in fairly good shape except for being sleepy," end quote. Barry interrupted his comments to ask Major Burke if he had found any spur marks on Poison, then continued his interview, saying, quote, "Some of the riders say I rode in a wagon, but they are liars. I have ridden on my 2 horses, Sandy and Poison, all the way. By the way, this first horse carried me 90 miles yesterday. There was a combination put up to beat me. The rest of the riders got out in front of me at the start, but when Cedar Falls was reached, I was in the lead and they had to follow me, and they had not caught up with me. Yes, I am glad to win, for it is an honor. Of course, I am glad it's over, but I am able to go on and do some more riding if necessary." End quote. Barry left the dining hall to check on the condition of Poison and to find a place to sleep. The second cowboy's arrival created greater excitement than had that of Barry 2 hours earlier. Just before 11:30 a.m., Emmett Albright, who had originated the idea of the contest, approached the finish line, his arrival being a surprise because he was thought to be near the rear of the race. Mounted on Outlaw, Albright made a dramatic entrance, which contrasted with Barry's subdued one. Quote, "He dashed up at a smart gallop and dismounted at the sidewalk. Leading his faithful animal, Albright walked through the gates to the tents and was informed that the entrance on foot would not do. He must finish on horseback. So, remounting, when every movement gave the most exquisite pain, he faced about, returned to the sidewalk, then rode through at the same fast gallop, reining up his horse sharply in the most approved cowboy style." End quote. He arrived with both horses and was accompanied by his brother-in-law, E.W. Weishart, who had joined him at Fort Dodge, Iowa. The horses, Outlaw and Joe Bush, were in prime shape, and Outlaw was reported by Major Burke as, quote, "endeavoring to kick everything within reach after he arrived at the stable," end quote. Albright volunteered to reporters the rumors that he had heard on the road. Quote, "I heard that I had no horses. I was dead and everything else. I could have beaten Barry, but I knew he was riding under protest, so I did not try. I think I got the first money," end quote. A United Press reporter got Albright to review his last day on the road. He said, quote, "I've been able to keep only 7 meals on my stomach since starting, and since reaching the grounds, I've been vomiting. For 5 nights, I have not slept except as I nodded while on horseback. But I feel pretty well now and think after eating something, I shall be able to sleep. I left DeKalb at 2 o'clock this morning, 2 hours after Smith and Gillespie. I don't know what's become of them. I did not see them any time on the way, but they have taken another route. I came by another road," end quote. The other road traveled by Albright was a very interesting road indeed, a railroad. It developed that after registering at DeKalb, Albright rode over to Dixon, obtained a boxcar, and shipped his horses to Chicago under the name of J. Johnson. After the arrival of Barry and Albright, the people of the Wild West show settled down to await the arrival of the other riders. Reporters sought to question Major Burke concerning Barry's riding under protest. Burke outlined the committee's desire to keep location of the route from the riders, Barry's help with laying out the route, and then his decision to ride, which brought out protests from the other riders. Burke declared it a question for decision in the future. Quote, "The principal thing is that their horses should come in good shape and that the race be one of honest endurance and skill," end quote. A great crowd gathered around the entrance to the showgrounds after word was passed around that Gillespie and Smith were only a few hours behind Barry. The size of the crowd was described as the largest since the Infanta of the Wild West show. Noon arrived, and despite a rumor that the 2 riders had lost their way, more and more people gathered. Just after 1 o'clock, a boy on a telegraph pole shouted, "Here they come!" The crowd began cheering. In a few minutes, old Joe Gillespie on Billy Schaefer came down the street with the horse at a trot and waving his sombrero to the cheering spectators. At 1:31 p.m., as Gillespie jumped from his horse and shook Buffalo Bill's hand, the crowd surged in to congratulate him, but he was tired and hungry and got away as quickly as he could. Shortly behind Gillespie was Charles Smith, who registered at 1:47 p.m. The crowd extended to Smith the same greeting it had given Gillespie, both of whom had been traveling together since Freeport. At Malta, Smith had left his horse, Red Wing, and continued to Chicago on Dynamite. At Mayfield, the 2 riders had been joined by 2 boys on bicycles who decided to ride part way with the horsemen. Gillespie and Smith remained together until about 2 miles from the showgrounds when Gillespie had urged his horse on and pulled away. Smith was described as looking every bit the cowboy. Quote, "He wore a wide-brimmed white hat, and at his heels were a pair of enormous spurs, but his horse showed no signs of their use, end quote. While all the excitement centered in Chicago, Stevens had reached DeKalb at 11:45 a.m. on July 27th, followed by George Jones at 12:30. The report came from DeKalb that Stevens' horse was, quote, so badly used up that he may not be allowed to proceed, end quote. Stevens himself sent a telegram from DeKalb claiming Gillespie, Smith, and Emmett Albright had not been riding square. Once the riders were inside the grounds, the horses were the focus of attention. John G. Shortall, president of the Illinois Humane Society, had 8 assistants on the ground to ensure the horses against ill treatment. Shortall, accompanied by 2 veterinary surgeons, conducted an inspection during which one of the horses tried to bite Shortall. Commenting that there was plenty of animation left in the steeds, he, quote, pronounced the horses all right and said there was no justification for the least interference on his part as agent of the Humane Society, end quote. Buffalo Bill announced that he was pleased with the race and its results. Reporters were given his account on the value of the race, writing, quote, there was a great deal more to the race than the mere first prize. It will show the world what the Native American horse is worth. European nations are watching the results of this race with interest. It is a test of the hardiness of the bronco, and after the wonderful result of 150 miles in 24 hours, 1,040 miles in 13 days and 16 hours, there will be a rush for the American animal. European nations will want the American-bred horses for their cavalry. Of course, on the entanglements of the riders and protests, I am not in position to decide, but I do say that the horses are in splendid condition. I was not surprised at that earlier, for it is just as I said a few days ago. The cowboys know that the horse is their best friend and that its best endeavors can be brought out by kindness and care. The virtues of value of the Chadron-Chicago Cowboy Race expounded by Colonel Cody were not shared by the Chicago intern Ocean. It saw the race proving little beyond the known fact that he who nurses the strength of his horse in a long race is likely to win over the rider who rushes his horse in the early part of the race. Since this fact was self-evident, the Inter-Ocean viewed the race as senseless and no test of the racing skill of the riders or of the speed of the horses. The race, it explained, could be viewed only as, quote, a trial of the relative power of horses to resist pain and weariness, and of the ability on the part of the riders to so distribute the amount of torture as to prevent it from breaking down before the goal is reached, end quote. It had nothing in common with legitimate racing, the newspaper concluded. On the humorous side of the race, Major Burke, in adding his enthusiastic summary of the race, disclosed his discovery that the riders constituted a lemonade brigade as he met them at the various registration points in Iowa and Illinois. Burke remarked, quote, they don't drink anything but lemonade, while I've brought a string of lemonade from Iowa to Chicago and the boys almost broke me, end quote. But Burke's comments on the drinking habits of the participants differed sharply from the account provided in Independence, Iowa, of the dietary proclivities of Rattlesnake Pete Stevens. The front page of the Chicago Tribune on July 2, 1893, reflected public interest in the Chadron-Chicago Race, according it a place among the leading events of the preceding week. The cowboy race gained space beside such national events as Governor Altgeld's pardon of anarchists, Congress being called into extra session, and the depression of the silver dollar. In addition, the Tribune carried information concerning the awarding of the prize money for the race on July 1, 1893. The award-given setting was the dining tent of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Present were the contestants and the people interested in the race. A discussion took place on the circumstances relating to the race, and Paul Fontaine of the Humane Society was empowered to make the awards, all contestants agreeing to abide by his decisions. Fontaine based his awards on the facts presented at the meeting and of his own personal knowledge and observation of the race itself. The technical objection to John Barry's participation was upheld. However, other writers recognized that he rode a fair race and allowed Barry to receive $175 out of the Buffalo Bill purse, as well as the saddle given by Montgomery Ward and Company for the first man into Chicago. Old Joe Gillespie, who was declared winner of the race, received $50 from the Buffalo Bill purse and $200 from the Chadron purse. Gillespie also received the Colt revolver. The complete distribution of prize money was made by Fontaine in the following manner. From Buffalo Bill's Wild West purse of $500, John Barry $175, Joe Gillespie $50, Charles Smith $75, George Jones $75, James Stevens $50, Doc Middleton $25, Emmett Albright $25, Joe Campbell $25. From the Chadron Committee purse of $1,000, Gillespie $200, Smith $200, Jones $187.50, Stevens $187.50, Middleton $75, Albright $75, and Campbell $75. The only rider not to receive a share of the purses was Dave Douglas, who dropped out of the race in its early stages. A biographer of Doc Middleton credits him with receiving, in addition to his money, quote, a gaudy velvet saddle blanket containing the wording Chadron to Chicago, end quote, which he is reported to have used for years. Those in Chadron responded to the end of the race by vocalizing feelings that they were glad it was over. The Chadron Citizen commented, quote, some of us may feel the touch of disappointment because our man, Doc Middleton, failed to win. But we can all feel satisfied in that the race went off as satisfactory as it did from a humane standpoint and brought us none of the disgrace that we have had preached to us, end quote. A citizen questioned in Lincoln, Nebraska, hoped Chadron was receiving its desired amount of free advertising. The Lincoln Journal said editorially, the race should serve as a good form of advertising for the Western Bronco, quote, a tough specimen of horse flesh, end quote. The Omaha World Herald, however, voiced its deep sense of humiliation because some rugged cowboy, one of the wild men of the range who wear leather clothes and drink petrified whiskey, had not won. Instead, it admitted the winner was a railroad man with a tenderfool name instead of a cowboy whose name suggested the wildlife of the roundup, such as Rattlesnake Pete. The Chadron Citizen reprinted a poem on the Chadron-Chicago Cowboy Race, which first appeared in the Republican of Rapid City, South Dakota, under the byline of Allen Penfield. The poem read, quote, out of Chadron, at the close of day, out to the sandhills lone and gray, cantered fleetly 10 horsemen bold, cantered like knights in days of old. Sleek were their steeds neath the saddles high, bright were the barrels at hip and thigh, broad were the brims of their sombreros, brave the mien of these range heroes. Each man grasped at his good right hand, haltered and led horse lone to brand. Back of each saddle closely lay, fastened by thongs the slicker gay. Out of the crack of pistol shot, out from the throngs that crowd the spot, canter these cattle cavaliers, their hoof beats drowned by deafening cheers. Full 300 leagues or more stretch twixt Chadron and Michigan's shore. There on the strand a city white gleams by day and glows by night. There is a goal of this famous race. There shall end the cowboy's chase. Up to the gates of that city strange shall ride a knight of the western range. Then to the herald upon the wall, this son of the saddle shall loudly call, say, young feller, produce the bun. I'm the winner of this cowboy run. Turn out my bronco on Columbian grass and let him graze while the nabobs pass. Say to all sovereigns here on tap that the king of the range is taking his nap. The 1,000-mile cowboy race was over. The Knights of the West had completed their tiring but celebrated contest and had received their various prizes. Although the people of the states of Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois, who had turned out in great numbers to greet the riders at the various towns and villages along the route of the race, would soon turn their attention to more immediate events, the cowboy riders had been at least momentary heroes, representing a group of men who are romanticized in American history and folklore up to the present day. The Cowboys of the West. The race of 1893 in no way was an example of a conventional thoroughbred race, but it was a testimony to the reliance of the frontier man on his horse. In contrast to the Eastern Humane Society's fears that the race would lead to the abuse or death of the horses, The riders safeguarded the well-being of their steeds more than their own. Representing more than a mere sports event, the cowboy race was an appropriate adjunct to the Columbian Exposition of 1893 and served as a fitting contribution to the America's celebration of its past. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcasts, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release a new episode on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.